It's just it's just a little bit of setting up and okay. All right. So, okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today at the launch of Paper and Text. So I'm William, the editor of the book. With me today is Rosalind Chua.
Hello.
Okay, and also Dr. Lalita Sinha.
Hello.
Usually, I was and when it comes to introductions, I'm not very good at introducing others. So I think perhaps it's best to let the two of you speak very briefly about yourselves. Okay. Would anyone like to introduce themselves first?
Perhaps Dr. Lalita could go first. Or...
Thank you. Actually, William has already introduced me. I used to teach in University Science Malaysia, comparative literature and comparative religion. And one of the subjects which I taught in school, in university was translation, literary translation, both at the graduate and undergraduate level. When I retired, I started to do translations with the Institute of Translation and Books, the Malaysian national body which was established for translations. And they commissioned me to do Malay literary texts, both modern and classic. And I have translated, at the last count, about 1 million words. Don't ask me about the quality, but it was sheer joy. I loved every minute of it. And I loved the way, especially traditional texts, the way language had such a musical and multi-layered nuances. And so that has kind of kept me mentally and physically alive. I've been retired for 12 years, and it's been great. It's been a great opportunity. And I have conducted a few literary translation workshops, one with Gerak Budaya, one with the university, and well, basically for anyone who wants to learn. So at the moment, I'm doing a project on children's literature. It's my first venture into children's literature. It's an illustrated series of Malaysian children's COVID-19 experiences. It's called Comics, Kids of Malaysia Initiative for COVID-19 Stories. And yeah, well, this is my, I'm grabbing this opportunity to say that I'm looking for partners, who would like to join me in this, illustrators, voice actors, stories. I would love to get stories from a broad cross-section of children, including, from B40 groups, children with reading difficulties, vulnerable groups, basically. And I'm looking both for volunteers and and partners. And if anyone is interested, I will put my Facebook link here later on if requested. Okay, that's me.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, so Rosalind, yeah, I guess it's your turn now.
Okay, my name is Rosalind. I'm the founder and publishing director of Clarity Publishing. We're based up in Penang. We started out mainly focusing on commercial nonfiction, but in the last couple of years, we're moving into fiction.
Okay, that's a very brief introduction.
Short and sweet.
Okay, great. So, so this is the book, right? So this is the book. It just arrived off the press just a few days ago. I think I should probably say a few words about how the project came about in the first place, because this ended up being a a very COVID-19 influenced project. So if I really had to trace back how the idea came about, I think it had started during my last visit to Singapore. So I was at the National Library down in Singapore, and they had an exhibition where they put up old manuscripts, old manuscripts from both the colonial period and in the pre-colonial period. So one of the manuscripts they had up there the was Munshi Abdullah's version of the Sejarah Melayu. And what the Sejarah about it is there are only a handful of copies um, uh, of that particular copy left in the world. So I think a lot of it might have just disappeared like over the years and with time. And all of this was printed, bound, published, probably inspected by the Munshi himself in Singapore 170 years ago. So just seeing that transposed across time, and again like those links. And the other thing that struck me as well was that Munshi Abdullah lived in a time where well, the whole, in terms of like publishing and printing and that sort of thing, it didn't quite exist again as the way we understand it now. But then again, you could see the start of like sort of like the modern printing press arriving, the start of what became eventually like international linkages between well, I suppose like book buyers, booksellers, and that sort of thing. So things were just really shaping up around that time. So the book itself isn't really it doesn't really go into that much detail historically about what occurred later on. So this was after the MCO was declared. So I was at home and I didn't really have any idea what to do. It was not a very fun time, just being stuck at home and everything. But the idea coalesced and came about in a way that what I eventually wanted to do was to put together this collection of voices from people involved in the book trade. So we have voices from translators, publishers, booksellers, and academics. So again, when you look at the idea of the whole book trade in Malaysian literature, it's really an entire ecosystem. It doesn't because people don't really work or exist in bubbles because all the work is really interconnected. So so in this case, this collection, it's actually a rather short one. It ended up at about 154 pages altogether. 154 pages altogether with 5 contributors. But I like to think that we've been able to cover a relatively good span of topics, even though it's only really like a very modest collection. So among the things we covered, of course, I think one place we can start with is to talk about a little bit about translation. So Dr. Lalita contributed an essay on the challenges faced, and of course the importance of literary translation. So that's something I'll talk to ask a little bit about in a little bit. And Rosalind's essay dealt with publishing in Malaysia. So this is a very large it's very concise, but it's a concise but a very large had a very large overview of like the different dimensions within the sphere of publishing, and discussions about again like international book trades, agents, and that sort of thing. Which and I suppose that the other thing is that if you look at a book as a transaction between like a reader and a writer, it's very easy to overlook all the steps that happen in between. Like, where does the publisher, the translator, the distributor, the academic, how do their roles play into within the larger ecosystem? So in essence, that's what the book sets out to do. This wasn't a very concise thesis statement, but the idea is to kind of open up conversations about the larger, broader idea of Malaysian literature and the book trade. So that's basically paper and text. And what we would actually like to see in the future. I'm not sure if anyone would ever want to take this on, but if we had books that could explore in more detail the different literary communities, so not just like the Anglophone readers, but again like readers in Malay, in Chinese, in Tamil, to see what and to again have a bigger, broader understanding of the various literatures that exist in the Malaysian context. Okay, so so in my case, because I was just the editor, so a lot of it was mostly stitching together all the different essays and finding ways by which so different points, different arguments, different perspectives could link up together. And because because we begin our book with Dr. Lalita's essay, perhaps you'd like to go. I can speak to you first about the work that you did on this one.
Okay, are you going to ask me questions, William, or am I going to launch into a lecture?
So in this case, we could take it either way, depending on what you personally prefer.
Well, I could answer your questions actually. What's of interest.
Okay, that sounds.
I guess from Ross as well. Yeah, anyone wants to ask questions?
Okay, so I'll start with a couple of questions. I think I'll start with the first question: the challenges in translating Malaysian literature. Again, I think it would be good to use Salina as an example, since I think most viewers would be familiar with Salina to some degree, and also like the specific challenges faced when doing that. Because in your case, what you focus a lot on is really translating the nuances that A. Samad Said wrote down all those many decades ago. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about, just very briefly, about some of the challenges that you saw during this translation.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'd like to start with a funny story. In the sense that Salina has been translated from Malay into English twice before. So the question to ask would be, why a third time? Well, what happened is the first time it was translated by an Australian scholar, researcher, and translator. And he shortened the book to about a third. So my curiosity was aroused as to what was lost in translation. And I found that a lot of it concentrated on conveying the story, not so much the characterization, not so much the setting, but just the story. It was a very radical shift in Malay literature, modern Malay literature, because it dealt with a taboo subject in those days from the 60s, the life of a Malay prostitute. Post-war, there were a lot of Malay women who were forced into prostitution due to poverty, and that they had lost their families, their livelihoods. So he was depicting. It was partly autobiographical, according to A. Samad Said. And yes, of course, the story is quite compelling, but it had a lot to do with the Malaysian milieu, Malaysian characters who interact with each other freely and frequently. And the Chinese characters have a certain identity, the Indian characters have a certain identity, which the author took a lot of pain and interest to portray. And the way he portrayed this through the language variation. There was a lot of variation. You could, even if you don't recognize them from their names, you can identify them with the way they speak Malay. I mean, the novel was in Malay, so the syntax of the language was different. It was not like, it didn't sound like an English text. But the author, the first translator, the Australian translator, Harry Abeling, it could have passed for any English story, any story in English, any piece of literature. And I would say literature within inverted commas, because it reduced the text so much, it diffused and it dispersed the impact of that characterization and setting so much that anyone looking at it would say, that's Malay literature. This man got a national laureate. It would be a big question mark. What's the quality of Malaysian literature? Then the same publishers, Dewan Bahasa dan Pustaka, commissioned another Malay translator to translate it into English. That was Hawa Abdullah. Now, Hawa Abdullah, although she's Malay, her education at that time, we are of that generation, just post-independent Malaysians who were equally good in English and Malay. Most of the younger people of my children's generation, they are much more fluent in Malay than they are in English. It has a lot to do with the education system. So I find that she was quite comfortable in both languages, and she was fully aware of the cultural impact of the story, of the words, of the characters. What happened is that in her enthusiasm to convey that very, very colorful local cultural milieu, there was a lot of over-explanation of cultural elements in the story, so much so that it expanded to by about a quarter of the original length, which was roughly about 500 pages, and this was slightly more. And it got a lot of criticism because at that time when it was produced in the early 80s, people said that the translator's English was not up to par. But what they missed is that she was also trying to use a variation of English to show the identity of the post-colonial community of Malaysia. Unfortunately, it did kind of sound a bit awkward, and it didn't make for easy reading. There was a lot of distracting details in the language. But I would say it was a better translation than the first one. So I wrote for my master's thesis, I did a study of the comparison of both these translations, and I wrote a critique. It was my research, and after that it was published by University Science Malaysia Press, and it got some good reviews. And at the book launch, A. Samad Said was present, and he just went up to to make a little speech, and he said, "Lalita, I nominate you to do a third translation." And I was just completely taken off guard. I wasn't prepared for it, and I'm not a professional translator. I haven't had training in translation. And I hadn't translated that much, but I was a literary person. I had a literary background, and I taught. They say those who can translate, those who can't teach. So I used to teach translation. But because I felt that I would not like to let him down, I took up the challenge, and I translated a third translation of it. So that's how I came to be the third English to Malay translation of the third text. And I haven't really come across that many reviews of the translation. What speaks for it is that the first run of 1,000 copies have all been sold out. It was published by ITBM, National Institute of Translation and Books, but unfortunately they have not reprinted it. I think it's been, financial complications, and they haven't reprinted it yet. So that's generally the backstory of how a third translation came about by me. There's a question, William, from Marie. Oh, Clarissa Lee. Is it for me? I think that you would answer that, right? It's more about the book history of the region. Sorry, I'm looking at from Marisa Swift to everyone, Clarissa Lee's question.
Crikey, I think that's more for you, Dr. Lalita.
Which question now is it? Let me see. That's Clarissa Lee's question. Oh, I see. There's a question before that from Marie. There is always a debacle of translating context, and how do we do that? Translate or deliver that when there may not be a direct word, phrase, translation in certain languages. Yes, surely that's a very big issue and a challenge. But speaking from experience, what works well is that we try to find equivalence in the target language in terms of idiom, or we try to find some other substitute. For example, we say noodles. If the original says laksa or mee or bihun, local noodles, we use the generic term noodles rather than that specific one, in case it's not understood. So he had, for example, when we talk about food, we say a bowl of noodles. Food is a very, very difficult thing to translate. Sometimes they have become well known, like nasi lemak. And nasi lemak, okay, the issue with that is that, do you italicize it to show that it's a foreign term? And then when it occurs 25 times, do you still italicize it? Or do you do that the first time, or do you put it in a glossary? So there is a range of options open to us, which we could use. What I have done is, if a term which is completely foreign, like not known, for example, a food which is not very well known to an English audience, I would put it in a glossary. And then I would use it throughout as part of the text, not differentiate it from the rest of the text. But something which has become quite commonly known, like nasi lemak or mee, for example, I would use it without any, and if there is a reader who is interested what's this stuff be, they would look it up, because we want to prevent the book from becoming an ethnographic or anthropological study. We do want to get the story on and the characters to speak naturally. So there's always that tension between some things we keep, some things we find a substitute in the target language for, and some of it we would like to introduce it to the foreign reader, because from my last research, I found that there are 150 English words which are originally Malay words in the dictionary, in the Oxford Dictionary. So that was very encouraging. Through constant use, translation becomes a bridge where the people from non-Malay speaking world would come to find it to be a familiar thing. Yeah. So does that answer your question?
I would say that it does answer. I think it does answer the question more than answers, but like above and beyond, I think.
Okay, I'll try not to be so long-winded then.
No, it's okay. No, because I think we do need that kind of sort of like the kind of background, because before moving into again and deeper nuances, the ideas of translation. But again, it's because like you say, translation does function as this bridge between different. Again, this functions a bridge between different literary communities, different circles, people working in different languages. So this actually works as quite a good time to bring up a project that Ross worked on. So this was actually the first. This was actually the first fiction book that she published, which I think you'll be able to tell us a little bit more about. I brought it up here as an example.
Thanks, William. Thank you for the plug. Actually, when I started Clarity Publishing, I never thought about publishing fiction in Malaysia, particularly English language fiction, because I think you're just asking for trouble. We all know about, the reading habits of most Malaysians that like to read in English, and you end up competing with huge UK and US publishers. So for a Malaysian publisher to sort of try and break into that, it does have its own challenges. Having said that, when I first saw the manuscript of Coldies, I was just absolutely blown away. The original book was actually in Lithuanian, but the author, she writes well in English, and so she had attempted to translate the first few chapters, which is that's what made the decision so easy to publish this book. And I'm just trying to think back, because 2 years ago seems like such a long time ago. So let's see. So yes, after reading the first few chapters, I was absolutely blown away by the writing, by the plot, by her style. And I had to really ask myself, do I want to be the idiot that turns the opportunity to publish this book down just because I said I will never do fiction? So, after a bit of soul searching and sleepless nights, tossing and turning, I thought, okay, you know what, let's just do it. Books like this don't come along that often. And we were also very lucky to get a translation grant from the Lithuanian Cultural Institute. So that made, complete sense to go ahead, to push on, get this translated, and to publish it in English in Malaysia.
And because you were speaking on, again, the help provided by the Lithuanian Cultural Center, I guess this is a question I have for the both of you. But in general, for both of you, like in your separate lines of work, what do you think of the level of institutional support that you have from, well, not just the government sectors, for example, but perhaps like other private sectors, or even like other like on cultural organizations like the Goethe Institute or Alliance Française, the British Council. I think it's something that it's a bit of an elephant in the room that we probably don't talk about when it comes to the book trade, because it doesn't feel like at some points it feels like we can't really support ourselves at times. But it's sort of something that I'd like to open up to the two of you.
Gosh, this is a...
Sorry, okay, Ross first. Ross, you go first.
Okay, this is a very, very tricky question. And as I said before, the process of getting the translation grant, sorry, from the Lithuanian Cultural Institute was actually very straightforward. It was a matter of filling out a very short form. And basically that was it. We already had our translator lined up. They released the funds very quickly. It was a very smooth process. So in that respect, if we hadn't had that financial support, I don't think we would have published that book. But your question, are you actually asking about Malaysian institutions?
I suppose institutions in general, but yeah, I guess Malaysian institutions specifically.
I really can't comment, because again, most of the titles we publish are in English, and we haven't had any, we haven't had any reason or cause to deal with ITBM, for instance. So I think it would be unfair for me to comment. So it's probably down to Dr. Lalita again to answer this.
Okay, Ross. But before I answer, I have a question, Ross, which is, you said that the author writes well in English.
Yes.
So I'm a little confused. Was the story translated by the author herself or himself?
Initially, we thought we would do that. We thought she gave it a go. She did a few chapters, and a few chapters were fine. But I think it was just taking such a toll on her, having to revisit it in the midst of also doing sort of some of the tweaks that were necessary for the Lithuanian edition. So in the end, we thought it made more sense to have a full-time translator work on her book and free her up.
Okay. All right. Any idea what the translation rates were? What did they pay? Was it, was it right, fair?
It seemed quite fair to me, but I think I would have to get back to you on that. That was a couple of years ago, so I could let you know. Not an issue.
All right, thank you. On the Malaysian scene, it doesn't pay well. Like, it could not sustain you, it could be something like a pleasure project that you do, or you have some other form of income, then it's all right. But if you do some other work, then you don't have much time left for the translation. And of course, there are time schedules, which you have to deliver the book by. Generally, as far as institutional support, I have done translations for government, for GLCs, for corporate bodies, for charities, quite across the board, NGOs and all that. Of course, the corporate bodies pay like 5 times more, but those are far and few, few and far between. And they like things like coffee table books, which are elaborate and grand and heavy, heavy volumes, hardcover, things like that. Not something you would be able to carry around. So that there's not that many of that. But the bulk of my translation has been through ITBM. They commission one by one, and they are quite generous with time. if you can't finish it on time, they're quite willing to let you extend it. But as far as the payment goes, it's, as I said, not enough to sustain you. The maximum you could get is about 20 cents a word, Malaysian. I mean, what you would get for a page would be about, it depends on how many words and the font and all that. But it's basically not much for a 60,000 book, which takes you about 3 or 4 months. You would get something like anything between 7 to 10,000 for 3 or 4 months of work. And it does go back a couple of times, except that as time went by, I noticed they never sent me back my manuscript, which is, I guess, encouraging. You know, maybe I improved, maybe they were not too worried about the quality, they just wanted quantity. I don't really know why they didn't send it back. But yeah, in terms of support, there is not that much work unless it is through your own context. Like I was moving around the literary circles, and many of the Malay poets and authors asked me whether I would translate a book of poems or, you know, an article. In the university, there were lots of academic staff who wanted their Malay work translated into English for foreign academic journals, that sort of thing. Yeah, but in terms of volume and in terms of payment, it's not a very encouraging state of affairs. Most of us who do, especially literary text, just do it for the, you know, for the pleasure of it. Yeah.
Sounds like you're describing jobs across the entire publishing industry, actually.
I
think from proofreading to copy editing to editing,
yes,
even design.
Mm.
And I guess the other challenge we have is, I suppose, like what feels like it's a very inherently divided local literary scene, because there's always the whole idea going back to like the national culture policy of national literatures versus sectional literatures, which really is quite a bit of a problem, I suppose, because there's official support for what we would officially consider national literature, but then if it's writing in, for say, the English language or Chinese language or in Tamil, for example, then it's really quite divided. But also feels like as a result of that, we develop very different writing communities, that don't really seem to interact with each other very much. This also does seem like a good point to revisit the earlier question that we didn't really get around to asking. So this to answering. So this was a question from Clarissa about well, how does this book? I assume that this would refer to paper and text as a collection, I suppose. How it contribute to the marginal repertoire of book history in this region. I think I can probably answer this as I go along, because since I was editing the collection, this book was only ever meant to be an introduction to what could possibly be further areas of study, further areas of interest for well, not necessarily just specialists, but members of the general public, which also became a bit of a challenge because when it comes to the book trade, it seems like there's so much to address, and how you begin to address it, it becomes a bit of a difficulty. But Ross, I have a question for you now, since as a publisher, you're quite privy to the different areas of how the book trades in, again, like I suppose even in like specifically within the English language book trade in Malaysia.
Okay.
How it relates again to the different circles of literary communities within Malaysia and further abroad. But maybe just very briefly, because I realize it's also like a very large question.
This is an extremely broad question. I mean, I think what is so fascinating about the book trade and, you know, literature in Malaysia is that you can walk into a bookstore in any city, in any town, you'll see English books, BM books, Chinese books on a shelf. Where else in the world, what other country do you go into and see, you know, books in different languages sitting side by side to, you know, to each other? I find that it's, you know, it's eye-opening. But as an English language publisher, I also feel that sometimes instead of, we're always looking for new writers, for English language writers. But I think time has come where we also need to look sideways at writers who write in BM, at writers who write in Chinese, and look at translating them into English to publish for a local audience. And I think that's something, it's something I would like to do down the line, down the road, but it's going to take some time to get to. And I think finding good translators to work with is, that's part of that's another piece of the puzzle.
Well, if I could jump in there, it relates both to what you just said, Ross, as well as what William said earlier about translation, bridging cultures. Just as you said, where in the world would you find books in 3 languages sitting next to each other? That's the very big advantage we have in Malaysia. Most Malaysians are trilingual, our mother tongue, English and Malay, at least these 3. Not only do we know the language, but we know quite a bit about each other's culture, habits, rituals, traditions, that kind of thing. And I think Malaysians should harness this kind of wealth of information and knowledge about each other, and and this would encourage writers as well as publishers to look for this kind of across the ethnic divide, books which relate to each other's cultures, the ethnic interaction, and either publish or translate those books that that come along, that portray this very multi-ethnic identity that is the character of a Malaysian person. So we have what they call the ability, the bridging language in translation. Sometimes, for example, if as you said, the Lithuanian, you would need a bridge translation from Lithuanian, for example, to Malay. You would need to translate from an English text, right?
Absolutely.
Yes. Whereas the advantage that we have is that we know 3 languages. So the bridge translation may not be that necessary. We know enough. What they call the difference between performance and competence in a language. We are competent enough not just to speak it, but to know more the cultural nuances and the idiom of each other's expressions. Yeah. So this is a very rich source of fiction, non-fiction, basically publishing.
Yeah, I think it's, it's high time we started to mine what we have in Malaysia. I mean, I'm always up for working with BM or Chinese publishers if they're interested in doing a rights swap. We could translate each other's work. I think that would be quite fun to do.
It would also be nice, I suppose in the future there was a chance to do to interact more with other literary communities. I mean, not necessarily far abroad, but even within the region, like Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, because I feel like we don't really talk to each other very much, even within the region, because we always seem either very Malaysian-centric or even, I suppose, at the furthest we try to reach out to sort of like the Anglo-American markets.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, we don't do a lot of talking to each other, like regionally. Do either of you see any signs of that potentially changing, or do you think we're still going to be inherently divided for the time being?
Again, this is a very difficult question to answer. I think it really boils down to the individual publishers. I would think that the larger publishers, and I'm talking about the big boys, they would have the time and the resources to be able to engage with international publishers, whether at fairs or overseas or in Malaysia. But for a small publisher like Clarity, I mean, there's absolutely no way we can even think that far ahead. Even just thinking about translating local books into English, it's quite a big hurdle for us.
Dr. Lalita, any comments on the situation?
Actually, we are all kind of in a state of suspended animation right now because of the pandemic. We don't know where it's going and how long it's going to be and what it's going to do to us, life as we know it, and more, what more the book industry. So it's hard for me to say where it could go and where we would all land up. And I think one of the very big casualties has been books, reading, writing books, just like the entertainment industry as well. But the potential is there. Earlier, as Ross said, it hasn't been tapped, and it's time we did that. So maybe like to start in that direction, which ties with just what Marie has written here, the comment, from stories from the indigenous cultures. They are one of the most prolific propagators of oral traditions, and their stories have come through to us from ancient times. Certainly, I am looking for for this children's book project. Children are great storytellers, just like indigenous communities, and they can just tell you stories for hours on end, with the right prompting and in the right circumstances. So these indigenous stories are real and raw, and they are also, they straddle the real world as we know it, the material world, as well as the paranormal world or the sub-material worlds. There is no dichotomy between the reality as modern and Western civilization knows it. So I think that recognition, of course, that has been portrayed a lot through magical realism in the Latin American literary tradition. But we have that right here in our indigenous communities. And for them, there is no difference between that world and this. And I think they make fantastic contribution. And, there's a wealth of, it's a treasure trove there waiting to be mined.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute the mic. No, there's fair comment, because there's so much that's just in front of us, and we, I suppose, in many ways we take for granted, and we don't pay nearly enough attention as we should. I suppose it's an evolution that has to come in the future. Okay, so Sweet was wondering if could hear a little bit more from Rose about her essay in this collection, but perhaps just if there's anything that you haven't specifically addressed, because I think one thing you were looking at is, again, you're also very interested in the essentially like the cultural power of the Anglo-American market and the effects it has on
no. No, I mean, I think the chapter was quite a rambly chapter on my part, probably because I was comparing, contrasting the time when I used to work in London in publishing with coming back to Malaysia and the realities of starting a publishing company, albeit on a much, much smaller scale. So if there's anything in particular you'd like me to ramble on about.
Well, there's any anecdote you have in particular? Maybe just one very short anecdote.
Oh no,
okay.
They're definitely not for public consumption, William.
Okay, no, not to worry. Okay.
Can I ask Ross? Could
Yes.
you tell us a little bit about the contents of the book? What is it that you find so fascinating about it that you venture out into literary publication?
Well, it was a bit controversial because it deals with, basically it deals with these three young men who are looking to find themselves. And of course, what do three young Matsales looking to find themselves do? They travel out to Southeast Asia and they decide to film a documentary about a very corrupt prime minister and his jewel-hoarding wife. And the controversy about this prime minister is how he's allegedly murdered his Mongolian mistress.
Oh.
So, you know how truth is stranger than fiction. So yes, it was set in a very, that places the book in a certain time and place, but that plot never takes over from what is actually going on in these three men in their lives and the sort of interactions they have and the culture shock they have while in Asia. So basically that was it.
Very, very
I think it was also the author's style because it was quite edgy. I think we're all very familiar with how British or American writers use slang. And because you have someone, I suppose you describe her as a post-Soviet writer from the first generation after the Iron Curtain came down. So her worldview is completely different from maybe a young English or a young American writer of that age. So it was a very, very different perspective. It was a very interesting perspective for me, for sure.
Okay. So they're not your typical eat, pray, love type of story.
No, I'm sorry to all eat, pray, love fans out there, but no, I don't think that's something I would want to publish.
All right, so it looks like there's another question that's come in. So this one's, this one's more of a publishing related question.
Yes.
Okay, so Ross, this one will definitely apply to you. So whether or not you depend on having how much you depend on having freelancers or collaborators to help out.
I mean, I don't think people realize how publishing depends completely on freelancers, not just in Malaysia, but all over the world. It's one of those industries where work has been outsourced for decades. And I'm not just talking about copy editing or proofreading or a bit of design. Entire books are often created by other companies who don't publish who don't publish these books themselves. They do what's called packaging. They package entire books for well-known publishers who then release it. So basically, yes, publishers, the entire industry depends completely from top to bottom. In every role you name it, there is a freelancer involved at some point of the way.
Sorry, I think I forgot to unmute again.
Yes.
I lost all my.
Yes.
I lost everything that I was saying just now. Okay, so I'll start.
Train of thought.
Yeah, I'll start again very quickly. So, okay, so what I think is that really in a bit of a flux right now because with regard to like where we are at within all the different areas of the Malaysian literary scene, as whether it's writers, publishers, translators, it's all really not very certain what the ground looks like given our whole situation under the CMCO and the current economy and I suppose to an extent also our political situation. So I suppose in a way this and even like with regard to the technology, because we might go into areas more of ebooks towards print on demand, different adaptations. So I guess after looking back at that, then the title of this book alone, Paper and Text, just ends up being weirdly anachronistic in a way. It's got a kind of weird throwback towards what we traditionally seen as the old book trade, but right now I just at this strange threshold, and I think it's just a matter of seeing what happens afterwards and keeping fingers crossed and hoping that things work out for the better. That seems like a very weirdly pessimistic note to end this particular book launch. So I suppose by closing comments, perhaps you do have more optimistic final statements.
Yes, William, that's terrible. How could you say that? I mean, I think people have been predicting the death of physical books for years and years and years now. But I think the fact of the matter is that physical books are still outselling ebooks, and there is so much space in the market for ebooks to exist with physical books side by side. There's absolutely no reason why that can't continue. And yes, we're going through a bit of a resetting period at the moment, but fingers crossed. I suppose we just have to be optimistic and try and hang in there until the new year.
Okay, that is a much more optimistic look at it. Dr. Lalita? for yourself, perhaps in relation to the larger world of translators out there?
Well, a thought just came into my mind that those characters in that book, Rose's book, Cold East, is it?
Yes.
It suddenly made me think of translators as being in a very powerful, glamorous, and high-profile world because the Mongolian model who was killed was his translator. And why haven't we been able to lead that kind of a life? But yeah, that's just anecdotal. What I feel is that it's an eye opener for me. I've just been educated. I didn't realize that there are as many print books or more print books than there are ebooks. That's quite an eye opener for me. I mean,
I think this is just sales statistics.
I see, and I feel that this book, I mean, this paper and text, is quite holistic in that it covers the life cycle of a book, so as it were, from conception to realization, and then intertextuality, of course, where translation is concerned. And so I think it's the kind of book that would appeal to a wider audience, the layperson, because so much of the time books have become so specialized, isn't it, these days? Not much audience. So I feel that there is a very good chance for this book, to do well on the market. Of course, I would say that there's a chapter by me, but well, I'm just joking. I think it is a very well thought out, conceptualized structure in the book. Yeah. Congratulations, William.
Thanks.
Yes, well done, William.
Thanks. I have a more optimistic way of ending. I've got a more optimistic kind of statement for myself now. After all of that, so I guess that's one of the joys of editing this book, is being able to try and find a way to link together all the different aspects within literature and the book trade. So when it first started out, there was really quite a bit of a challenge, because the question was, how do you begin and how do you try to find something that was relatively cohesive? Honestly, I'm not sure if I found the answer with the book, but that's why I'm hoping it's really like a doorway to open up more questions, more possibilities, more chances for anyone out there who wants to take a more holistic look at it than what I'm able to do, because I guess my only limitation is I'm really, at the end of the day, just one single person looking in at the edge of something that's really like this huge, vast, and at times often very incomprehensible, but very magical at the same. But it's magical world of books and literature. So it's always, I guess, always a process of exploring for myself. And while I don't think I'll take on another project like this again, because it's also been mentally quite draining, quite exhausting. But I would really want to see if anyone's able to take on something that goes on from here, that builds on from all of this. I really would like to see where it goes from here. So
I would add, William, that you are a fantastic editor. Oh. I was quite amazed at what you were able to do with my rambling text and ideas and thoughts, and how you kind of express things so succinctly, and it was it was better than what I had written. So kudos to you for that.
No, thanks so much. I'm very glad to hear that. Okay, so I guess with that, that brings us to the end of the launch of today's book. I have to insert a corporate statement in here. So the book is available on their website for 23 ringgit. It's actually part of a larger series called Swadaya Essentials. There's quite a variety of different. So this series will cover quite a different variety. There'll be books on architecture, potentially one on visual art, and perhaps quite a few more interesting areas to come. So corporate stuff aside, I would say that thanks so much to Ross and Dr. Lalita for joining us, making time for us this Friday afternoon, and of course for writing the essays in the first place. It really was a pleasure to work with the both of you. Okay, so with that, I think that's a good time to wrap up. Okay, so thanks.
William, can I just ask a question?
Yeah,
A quick one. Basically, how did you tie this book up with the Georgetown Literary Festival? What was the route that you of it being included in the GTLF events?
Oh, right. Okay, so this one's a bit of a difficult question to answer. How it worked out in the end, I think it's also a matter of working with, again, like different literary communities and everything, because it really is a very strange, very tough year for everyone, even for festivals, even with the requisite state funding, with the cultural capital that's been built up, because the challenge is how you find a way to keep things going, even when it's just difficult just to get things off the ground in this year. So it just came about by asking questions, speaking to festival co-directors, and finding a way by which by which we could be included and to help out at the same time. So it's also like a matter of finding ways to collaborate across different fields and help each other out, um, and that sort of thing. So I guess it speaks to the importance of having those literary communities out there which are able to provide mutual support, and not see it as a competition, a dog eat dog kind of world, but rather as a way in which we can all provide some modicum of mutual aid for each other, and to together, I suppose, put in a corny way to create a stronger like local literary scene and that kind of thing.
Thank you.
Okay, super. Great. I suppose so. Okay, so I think for now that I suppose it brings us to the end of our session, our live session today. Then. Okay, great. All right. So okay, thanks again so much for being here, and
Thanks, William.
no, for sure. And to all viewers out there, do get in touch with us if there's any questions, comments, and so on. And yeah, of course, and we do hope that you enjoy the book. And we'll see you again in the next series of events in this long festival. Okay. Okay. Take care, everyone.
Bye.